Welcome, everyone, to the Lion Counseling Podcast. I'm Mark Odland, founder of Lion Counseling and certified EMDR therapist.
And I'm Zack Carter, counselor and coach.
And our mission is to help men to break free, heal deep, and become the lions they were created to be. Today's episode is on forgiveness. Forgiveness sounds like a good thing in theory, right? Until you're the one who's actually been hurt. And so in this episode, we'll tackle why forgiveness sometimes feels so impossible, what keeps us stuck in anger, and how to move forward in freedom without pretending that the pain didn't matter. Make sure to hang on till the end. We've got some practical ideas for how you can actually do this, not just theory, but also how to put it into practice. So with that being said, let's do it.
Escape the cage now. Be the lion you was destined to be. Born ready for the war, now my effort is free. The level's been set, time to wrestle the beast. Testing my G, it's getting heavy indeed. The struggle I embrace now, never retreat. I see the test as a blessing indeed. I'm taking steps on the treacherous peak. Now it's destined to be. I'm on my destiny's feet. Shine with the one piece.
All right, Mark. So tell us, what is forgiveness? How do you define it?
Oh man, that's loaded, right? It's used all the time, this word, but often we don't define it. And I think, people come from different reference points, right? From a biblical perspective, right? Forgiveness is basically releasing the anger and the bitterness and wishing well for the other person, basically not holding that thing that they did against us, right? From a psychological perspective, which has kind of become more trendy in recent years, they've talked about forgiveness not quite being a gift for the other person, but more as this thing that you do to kind of free yourself from these toxic negative emotions that you carry around. And I think that there's obviously merit to both sides, to both angles on that definition. And I think as we get into our conversation, we're going to kind of flesh out what actually makes sense and what actually fits with that. So.
Well, do you hear definitions of forgiveness that you would disagree on?
Well, I guess I'll just get it out there right away. I would say I think the psychological component has a kernel of truth, but I think it's incomplete in the sense of when we make it only about ourselves, then it kind of loses that relational component that actually changes something. And I will say too that within Christian circles, sometimes there's a confusion that forgiving someone inherently means we have to restore the relationship to its previous form. And when it comes to things like abuse and really toxic relationships, really unhealthy relationships, forgiveness might be a gift to the other person. It might be something that unburdens them to know that they've actually been forgiven. And that actually is a cool thing. It can be unburdening for us by doing the forgiving, but it doesn't mean we necessarily become best friends with them again, right? I mean, you hear these dramatic stories, right, of someone who killed a family member, and what could be more devastating than that? And then, the parent or the surviving family faces their accuser when they're on the stand in court, and they say because of their Christian faith that they actually forgive that person. That person might still have to face the earthly consequences in this kind of cause and effect, reaping and sowing world that we live in, where they might still have to serve time in jail. But there was still something powerful about that interaction that happened for both parties involved, right? And then you could even go deeper with our relationship with God. But so yeah, I think to answer your question, I would say it definitely, I think the psychologists and the therapists are onto something when they say there is a freedom that comes for the forgiver, the person forgiving in many cases. But if you completely disconnect it from how it impacts the other person, sometimes it's not a complete picture.
Okay. And so it sounds like, kind of reading between the lines, that you're basically saying we're not condoning the behavior, and it's actually not the same as reconciliation because you're going to choose whether or not to reconcile with the other person.
That's right. That's right. Because that can be a tricky thing in therapy, right? Especially people coming to quote unquote Christian counselors. That's a lot of the work that sometimes we do with people who hold their faith important. And there's a fear that if I forgive this person, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to go to Thanksgiving with my abuser? Does that mean that I have to become best friends with this person who hurt me? And it's like, no, the answer, boundaries and protection are still important, right? And so, yes, I think that puts it well. It's not the same as reconciliation. And it's also not the same. This kind of gets into further down kind of our conversation, but it's not also not the same as saying what happened was okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that keeps us from forgiving others, right? Sometimes we are hurt so deeply that there is that side of us, that ugly side of us that wants revenge, that we want them to feel pain. We want them to feel punishment. Um, the more generous interpretation is we're so desperate for someone to understand our pain, and they're so unable to really empathize with us and validate our pain that we want a way to hold something over them so they could. We're forcing them to feel it. We're forcing them to
Mm-hmm.
get it. I mean, you could see this in the couples we work with sometimes, that when
Mm-hmm.
old hurts come up that were a decade old and now they're resurfacing in session like they happened yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and that can keep us from forgiving, right?
Mm-hmm.
um the belief that they don't deserve it, right? That can be a big one, a barrier to forgiveness. They don't deserve my forgiveness. We'll return to that one because that's a tricky one. Um, and then again, self-protection. I see this in the trauma work that I do a lot. Is there's something about we talk about what forgiveness is, but what is not forgiveness, or what holds that space emotionally in a state of unforgiveness? It
Mm-hmm.
can look like bitterness. It can look like anger. It can also look like power. It can look like self-righteousness. It can look like adrenaline. It can look
Mm-hmm.
like I'm protecting myself. And to forgive, it feels like this act of weakness sometimes, especially for us as guys. Like it feels like I'm really gonna just like let them win. Like, is that what I'm doing? I'm letting them win by forgiving. And so it can feel like you're laying down your weapons. Um, which ironically is kind of what Jesus did when he went to the cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what Peter didn't want to do when he picked up his sword and cut off the guy's ear. But
Mm-hmm.
in good old Peter, right? He's like, "How many times should I forgive, Lord? As many as 7 times?" Uh, and depending on the translation, it's like either infinite or 7 times
Mm-hmm.
70 or 77 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea that no, like we have to forgive as a way of life. And interestingly enough, for those in our audience who are Christians, that is one of the hallmarks, one of the defining things that makes Christianity different, is because it's all based on the idea that we know that we need forgiveness from God because we're not perfect. And so, therefore, kind of who are we to think that we should withhold that from others because they do, and that comes back to that question of, well, they don't deserve it. Well, and here's the tough pill to swallow. We don't either,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's kind of the bitter pill, and that's why sometimes the evangelist will say, "Man, just accept Jesus and everything in your life's going to be awesome." It's like, well, it's actually can be kind of a hard path. It can
Mm-hmm.
actually be a path of sacrifice and suffering, and again, metaphorically and literally, sometimes laying down those weapons and putting yourself at risk
Mm-hmm.
emotionally or physically. Um, Within reason, there's still room for boundaries and self-protection as well, right? As Jordan Peterson says so well, meekness does not mean being a wimp and incapable of protecting your family or yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like you got that sword,
Mm-hmm.
but you have such self-control, and like the martial artists know, you
Mm-hmm.
try not to fight whenever possible,
Mm-hmm.
but the sword is there if you need it, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, Mark, I have, I find that I have a lot of guys that have maybe made mistakes in their relationship that was really hard on their partner, and their partner is constantly bringing up the past constantly, and so you can kind of see, a difficulty in forgiving, and so if someone has experienced some kind of trauma, whether it's like cheating in a relationship
Mm-hmm.
or some kind of abuse or whatever, and then one party is like, hey, I want to kind of move forward, I want to like heal, I want to get better, can traumas impact our ability to forgive in some way?
For sure. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that even the gurus of couples counseling, the Gottmans, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Gottman, I recently was going through some of their work, and they had a really lengthy article on infidelity. And they basically said the most helpful way to conceptualize infidelity in a relationship is a trauma. And when you're the one who, if you're the spouse who actually did the cheating, it's not about casting blame, or like, it takes two to tango, and there's this whole context of why these things happen in a relationship or in a marriage. But for the one who engaged in infidelity, that first stage for the Gottmans was atonement. It's basically sitting there and being like, all right, this is going to take a while, and this is going to be me in a state of empathy and humility. And just when I think they should be over it, or they should have forgiven me by now, no, they're going to want more. They're going to want to know something else. They're going to be hurt by this other reminder, and they're triggered all the time. And you're like, why are they being so irrational? Well, actually, it's perfectly rational when you know how the brain holds trauma and what PTSD looks like. And so if you start to think about someone who's been wounded by an affair as having some kind of mini version of PTSD, all of a sudden the behavior makes a lot more sense, right? And so I guess what I would say about trauma, and I think maybe I would kind of conclude our talk on forgiveness today with naming the impact of trauma more specifically on how it impacts forgiveness, and then maybe ending with some practical ideas to kind of take those steps forward in what it actually looks like to forgive someone. I'll throw out some ideas. If you have any other ideas, Zach, or any curiosities, we can go there too. But one thing I see a lot as an EMDR therapist, and again, for those of you who haven't heard about EMDR by now, I mean, research proven method for healing trauma, and the most powerful I do it every day, 90% of my clients, and it really gets the truth from the head to the heart and helps people to heal deeply by specifically healing wounded memories in a way where, visceral, vivid, painful images start to fade. Negative lies and beliefs about ourselves get reshaped from a truthful perspective, and intense emotions actually get desensitized and calmed down. And so here's a classic example. I'm working with, say, a 55-year-old executive, right? Doing well in life, a lot of good things, and yet he's been haunted for years by being bullied by, say, an older classmate when he was in elementary school, right? And it's always left with this feeling of not being good enough, right? Of being weak. And so we're reprocessing these old memories that they supposedly should have been over, right? But the trauma brain doesn't know it's over, right? It's stored it differently. And so what I see is sometimes therapists and pastors will rush people to forgiveness too quickly. They'll kind of say, hey, you're obligated to forgive because Jesus did command it. It is a command. But sometimes what happens is we rush past the trauma, we rush past the pain, we rush past the anger, and then we say the words I forgive, but then it doesn't stick. It ends up being just words, because and it's not that I'm discounting that someone wants to forgive, because sometimes there's genuinely that desire to forgive, and then they're just so flustered when their spouse, who they forgave, right, says or does something that stirs up that trauma, and then all the feelings of forgiveness just disappear. They're out the window, they're gone, and they're left with all these feelings of what it felt like before they forgave them, right? So how do you get the forgiveness to stick? Okay, so in a moment we'll get to some practical ideas for how to do that. If there's trauma, sometimes the practical ideas aren't enough. And so if there's trauma, here's what that looks like. I've got the executive in my office. He's working through the memory of being bullied. We're doing the EMDR, and over the course of EMDR, typically I see this emotional arc that people go through. So this guy in my office, he would first re-experience the feelings of helplessness and weakness, right? And he feels very small. But then as we keep progressing, now he starts to remember, like, oh, wait a second, I'm a lot stronger than I used to be. I'm not that little kid anymore. Oh man, yeah, if I feel guilty about this, but I just imagine going in and beating this kid up, and now he can't bully me anymore, right? And so what happens is it starts out with reliving the trauma, and then the brain says, I want to feel the opposite of that, and so then it moves toward power and competency, and so they have this experience, sometimes with images and imagination, where they see themselves as stronger. They remember their current strength. They maybe even have some kind of imaginary confrontation with their bully or their abuser, where they come out on top. And guess what? Now their nervous system's starting to kind of feel strength, and that feeling of weakness is kind of disappearing. And then they get through that feeling of anger, and we do some more MDR, and now they're starting to feel sadness. They're finally over the trauma, and now they're starting to see, like, man, that was really sad that kid went through that. And now that I'm a dad, I think about my own kids and what if they went through that? Oh my gosh, that would be heartbreaking, right? And then then sometimes they start to feel, as they progress, they start to think about their abuser, their bully. And without me forcing it as a therapist, they start to connect the dots. Oh yeah, yeah, I kind of know why they were a bully. Like all the kids were talking about it. That kid lived in the trailer and he didn't have a dad and his mom was on, whatever. Not excuses, but understanding that things shape us, right? And now all of a sudden, that man in my office is starting to feel empathy and feel sadness for the person who hurt him. And guess what? When they get to that point, without me ever saying, have you thought about forgiveness? Those emotions are precisely what forgiveness feels like. Mm. And sometimes they'll come to that on their own. They say, you know what, this sounds crazy, but I feel like I'm actually forgiving them right now. Mm. And when they're able to process it at such a deep level like that, the forgiveness tends to really stick. And so that's a beautiful thing to watch. And again, it's not about that person who hurt us deserving it. Forgiveness is not about them deserving it. It's about being who we're called to be and releasing the psychological perspective, releasing the pain and being unburdened by this. And then also for our clients who are men of faith to be able to say, I'm trying to live into that calling to forgive as I've been forgiven too, right? So to wrap things up now, Zach, we're coming to that practical side of things. Mm-hmm. I've got a couple ideas, but I was curious to check in with you. Any thoughts on that or any ideas that you've seen with clients who are struggling to forgive, things that could be helpful?
Yeah, really difficult. And I love really how you've laid out why it happens, here complicating factors. And so I do something similar in my approach through the cognitive behavioral perspective, and that's through something called a genogram. And so especially if it's family members. So if your parents or your grandparents or aunt and uncle or brothers, whatever. So if there are people in your family that have hurt you, typically I go through a genogram, which basically if you have never heard of a genogram, you can look it up online, mm-hmm. but it's very similar to a family tree with more information essentially. So a family tree is going to let you know, here's the connections to all the people in my family, all the way coming down to me. And if you have kids, going down into your kids as well. But what a genogram does is that you basically sketch out your family. So you start with yourself in the middle and then you work, okay, here are my parents, here's my brother and sister. And then like, here are their parents, here are their brothers and sisters. And you can go to their, your great grandparents and their brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. And so as much information as you have, you can go back and then you can create symbols or colors based on different things that happen in those different families' lives. And so if someone was physically abused, sexually abused, if there was a divorce, if there were addictions in the family. And so, for instance, if you struggle with addiction, you're like, where did this come from? Why do I struggle with this? It's like, okay, well, did either or both of your parents struggle with addiction? It's like, well, yeah, they had these addictions. Okay. And then what about their parents? Yep. Like, oh yeah, well, their parents actually had addictions as well. And then suddenly you see the line going all the way down to you. And so when you have the urge to just blame your parents or blame your grandparents, you're like, oh, like their parents were abusive to them or their parents were addicts as well. And this is what they grew up around. What do you expect if someone grows up in a household where people are smoking or drinking or doing cocaine or whatever? Once again, I like what you said, that it's not about excusing the behavior, but it's about understanding. Right. And then when you understand it, one, that gives yourself a little bit of empathy of like, if you are struggling with something yourself, you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, look at all the hurt that's gone through all the generations. But at the same time, you get more empathy for the family. Once again, doesn't mean going back to reconciliation versus forgiveness. It doesn't mean you have to reconcile, but it helps to allow you to forgive so that you're not holding on to it yourself. So that's the main thing I do with clients. Yeah. Or is there anything that you've found particularly helpful with clients?
Yeah, that's powerful, Zach. I mean, yeah, and I think that's looking for patterns and being honest about them, as like you said, through the genogram, like that's a powerful way to do it. For whatever reason, I think intuitively, regardless of like your theology about like age of reason or original sin, things like that for our Christian guys, I think intuitively we just know that at some degree, the younger a child is, the less culpable they kind of are for
Mm-hmm.
their actions. We get that we're not, maybe we're not blank slates, but there is a sense that if it feels all the more tragic if someone messes with a kid, right? And so that being said, I've done an exercise before when, say, someone's trying to forgive their spouse, when a spouse goes into a certain behavior or way of reactivity, and I say, do you have any photos of your spouse when they were like 5?
Mm.
Oh yeah, somewhere. It's like, what would it mean if the next time your wife got triggered or your husband got triggered, you could think of that photo in your mind and be like, I'm not even arguing with the 30-year-old in front of me, the 40-year-old in front of me. I'm arguing with a wounded kid.
Mm.
And if you imagine yourself arguing with a wounded kid, then you can, if you're a parent, then you can tap into like your dad brain and be like, what does a wounded kid need who's re-experiencing a trauma? They might need a hug. They might need some compassion. They might need some understanding. They might need someone to help kind of regulate them. And so that can be a powerful exercise in empathy.
Mm.
Another exercise in empathy I'd leave you guys with, again, for our Christian guys, is Jesus on the cross, man. I mean, he. I always thought it so mysterious that he not only said, "Forgive them, Father," as they were killing him, but he added that extra part. They know not what they do.
Mm.
Why did he throw that in there? Maybe there's something about just realizing that most people are operating out of woundedness and ignorance, not as an excuse for their behavior, but again, a way to understand there are reasons why this is happening. It actually shouldn't surprise us, right? And that just like Jesus could have called that legion of angels to protect himself, and he didn't. No one took his life. He gave it up freely, and he can take it back again. We can step boldly into that idea of forgiving as men and say this isn't an act of weakness or cowardice. This is an act of strength, and the world doesn't understand forgiveness and doesn't know how to do it very well, but we can be those men who kind of model it for others, model it for our families, our friends, our communities, and our kids. And as it happens, we see some relationships don't heal, some relationships do, and whatever happens with the relationship, we can be freed from the toxicity and the pain and the bitterness inside and the hurt inside, and feel like we're stepping more in line with the way, as we talk about on our website all the time, right? The lions that God created us to be. So with that, that's all I got, Zach.
Me too, man. That was great. Yeah, thanks for laying that out for us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for listening, guys. EscapeTheCageNow.com. Please check us out. Zach and I are always here to help. Happy to do a free consult if you want to test the waters and see if it's a good fit to work with us. So until next time, take care.
All right, bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye.